What if I told you that every major American war from the Revolution that birthed the nation to the global war on terror was not just a conflict of ideologies, but a colossal business opportunity for the exact same families? This is not speculation. This is not a conspiracy. This is the documented, verifiable history of how American dynasties were forged in the fires of war, built on government contracts while millions of soldiers. T here is a business model woven into the fabric of American history that's more profitable than oil, more reliable than banking, and more protected than any monopoly ever conceived. It has created fortunes that span 6 generations, dynasties that command billions in assets, and it has funded political careers, entire university endowments, and massive charitable foundations. Profit from war, every war, any war, because while soldiers bleed on the battlefield and taxpayers foot the bill, a very small, very elite group of companies always wins. The contracts are public record, the profits are documented in quarterly reports, the pattern is aberrator, May. Then there are the Rockefellers whose oil and fuel empire powered the machines of war from the Civil War through the conflict in Afghanistan, 160 years of maintaining an energy monopoly during times of global conflict. We have the Morgan banking dynasty, the financiers of war, who bankrolled conflicts from the Spanish-American War through World War II, ingeniously lending to governments and profiting from both sides of the fight. There's Lockheed Martin, or more accurately its predecessors. Titans of aviation and weapons who have dominated defense contracts from World War I through to this very day, over a century of building the tools of destruction. And finally, Halliburton, the masters of military logistics and infrastructure, whose no-buy contracts and massive cost overruns became legendary from World War II through the War on Terror, 80 years of rebuilding with the bombs destroyed, 5 families, 5 corporate empires. And if you dare to track their profits across the timeline of American wars, you will see the same sickening pattern repeat itself with the precision of a metronome. A war is declared and their stock prices surge. Contracts are awarded, often without competition, and their profits explode. When the war finally ends, they keep the money. And when the next war inevitably begins, they are ready, because they did not just profit from war. They actively helped create the conditions that made war inevitable. They did it through relentless lobbying, through massive political donations, through the careful shaping of American foreign policy. This is not some hidden secret. This is capitalism applied to its most brutal and logical. And the receipts, they are all a matter of public record. Let me show you how it works. War by war, contract by contract, dollar by dollar, starting with a family that literally invented the American military-industrial complex, the DuPont family. If you have heard of them, it is probably for consumer products like Teflon or advanced chemicals. But the foundation of the immense DuPont fortune was built on something much more explosive, gunpowder, and they have supplied the raw materials for destruction for every single American war since 1802. Let's start with how they brilliantly positioned themselves. Eleuthère Ayrtonnet DuPont arrived in America from France in the year 1800. He was a highly trained chemist who had worked in the finest French gunpowder mills, and he saw a golden opportunity. America had just fought a revolution and was aggressively expanding westward. This meant a constant, insatiable need for explosives, for clearing land, for mining precious resources, and most importantly, for war. In 1802, he founded the DuPont Company on the Brandywine River in Delaware. The location was a stroke of strategic genius close to the political centers of Philadelphia and Washington, with ready access to water power for the mills, and just far enough from major cities that the inevitable cataphragix blacks. By the War of 1812, DuPont was the primary supplier of gunpowder to the United States military. This was their first major government contract, and it established the blueprint that would be replicate for 2 centuries to come. A war begins. The government desperately needs explosives, and DuPont is ready with existing capacity. They get the contract, they massively expand production, they make enormous profits. The war ends, they keep the newly built infrastructure, and they simply wait for the next conflict. The Mexican-American War, from 1846 to 1848, saw DuPont supply the gunpowder for American artillery and small arms. The contract was worth over $1 million, which is approximately $35 million in today's money. But the real value was not the cash. It was cementing DuPont as the government's preferred, indispensable supplier. When you are the company that delivered victory during the last war, you are always first in line for the next one. The Civil War, from 1861 to 1865, was DuPont's absolute breakthrough. The Union Army required gunpowder on a scale never before imagined. 4 years of continuous brutal warfare, hundreds of major battles, millions upon millions of rounds fired. DuPont's mills ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They produced over 4 million pounds of gunpowder for the Union cause. The contracts were worth over $10 million, a figure that translates to over $300 million today. And that was just their direct sales to the government. DuPont also sold to private contractors, who then sold the same gunpowder to the government at a significant markup. And here's where the story gets morally complex. the DuPont family were Northern Democrats, who staunchly opposed the abolition of slavery. Some influential family members even politically supported the Confederacy, but they sold their gunpowder exclusively to the Union because that is where the lucrative contracts were. Ideology was irrelevant, profit was everything. And after the war, when the Union emerged victorious, DuPont was masterfully positioned as a patriotic company that helped save the nation. World War I, from 1914 to 1918, was the conflict that transformed DuPont from a large, successful company into an untouchable global dynasty. Before America even entered the war in 1917, DuPont was selling millions of pounds of gunpowder. When America finally joined the Allied forces, DuPont's production increased exponentially. They built massive new plants, hired thousands of workers, and ultimately supplied 40% of all explosives used by the entire Allied forces. The profits were simply staggering. DuPont's net earnings skyrocketed from $5 million in 1914 to $82 million in 1918. That is over $1 billion in today's currency. In just 4 years, they increased their profits by 1,600%. And here is the critical part of their strategy. After the war, they did not return that money to the public. They diversified. They used those war profits to build a peacetime empire in chemicals, plastics, and synthetic materials. But they never stopped selling to the military. World War II brought another massive surge in demand. DuPont supplied explosives, nut-knee for parachutes, and even worked on the top-secret Manhattan Project. They operated the plutonium production facility at Hanford, Washington. The contract was structured as cost-plus, meaning the government paid all of their expenses plus a guaranteed profit. It was literally impossible for them to lose money. The government absorbed all the risk. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, every single conflict saw DuPont or its successor companies supplying critical materials. By the 2000s, DuPont's dedicated defense divisions. The DuPont family trust is now worth an estimated $30 billion, 6 generations removed from Elithaire Irtene DuPont, and they are still living off the profits of gunpowder now. Let's talk about the Rockefellers and their black gold oil. The one resource that every single modern military is completely dependent upon, and the family that monopolized it for the better part of a century. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. By 1880, he controlled a breathtaking 90% of America's entire oil refining capacity. This was not just a business. It was a monopoly of unprecedented scale, and when America went to war, that monopoly became a criticature. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was a small conflict, but it was significant for one reason. The United States Navy had just transitioned from coal-powered ships to oil-powered ships in the 1890s. This single technological shift made Standard Oil essential to national security. Naval vessels needed fuel oil, and Rockefeller had it all. The war lasted only a few months, but it established oil as an absolute military necessity. Rockefeller supplied the fuel for the fleet, and he learned a very valuable lesson. Control the fuel, and you control the military. World War I was the first truly industrial war, a conflict where oil was the decisive factor. Tanks, trucks, airplanes, and ships all required vast quantities of petroleum products. And Standard Oil, though technically broken up by antitrust action in 1911, still dominated the market through its numerous successor companies. Corporate giants we now know as ExxonMobil and Chevron, all still controlled by Rockefeller interests. They supplied fuel to the United States millions, but here is where the Rockefeller strategy diverged. They did not just sell to one side. Standard Oil's German subsidiary, DAPG, sold fuel directly to Germany. Even after America entered the war, Rockefeller companies expertly traded with Germany through neutral countries. This was not considered treason. It was the companies were technically separate corporate entities. The profit skimmed from both sides of World War I turned the Rockefellers into the wealthiest family in the history of America. John D. Rockefeller became the world's first billionaire, and the family diversified into banking, real estate, and philanthropy. But oil always remained the bedrock of their fortune will end. War II saw the very same pattern. The Rockefeller companies supplied fuel to the United States military through exclusive cost-cruda contracts that guaranteed massive profits. Standard Oil of New Jersey, the predecessor to Exxon, was even investigated by Congress for continuing to trade with Nazi Germany. This gave Germany access to technology that prolonged the war and cost countless Allied lives. Senator Harry Truman, before he became president, led the investigation. His committee concluded that Standard Oil's actions had actively damaged the American war effort, but no one was ever prosecuted. The company was simply too big and too important. The military needed their fuel, so the investigation was quietly shelved, and the lucrative contracts continued to flow. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, every conflict demanded oil, and ExxonMobil and Chevron, the Rockefeller successors, were there to supply it. The profits became so astronomically large that by the 1970s, the Rockefeller family began strategically divesting from oil to avoid intense political scrutiny. but the wealth remained. The Rockefeller family fortune is estimated today at $11 billion, a fortune built on oil sold to armies that burned it while fighting endless wars. Now, we turn to the Morgan banking dynasty and the art of war financing. Because wars do not just need weapons and fuel, they need money, oceans of it, and the people who lend that money profit handsomely, regardless of who wins or loses. J.P. Morgan founded his banking empire in the 1870s. By 1900, J.P. Morgan and Company was the most powerful bank in America. Perhaps the world and Morgan understood a fundamental principle that would define a century of war profits. Governments at war will borrow money at any interest rate. They have no choice. The only alternative is defeat. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was financed in part through Morgan loans to the United States government. They were small loans for a small war, but it established the critical relationship. The government trusted Morgan, and Morgan profited from the interest. World War I was on an entirely different scale. When war erupted in Europe in 1914, America was officially neutral. But American banks, led by the titan J.P. Morgan, lent over $2 billion to Britain and France between 1914 and 1917. That is over $50 billion in today's money. The loans were used to buy weapons, food, and supplies, much of it from American companies. So American banks lent money to the Allies, who then spent that money buying goods from American companies. The money circulated within the American economy, but the profit stuck to the bankers and the industrialists at both ends of the transaction. Here's the critical turning point. Those loans made American neutrality an economic impossibility. By 1917, Britain and France owed such an immense sum to American banks that their defeat would have triggered a catastrophic financial crisis in the United States. If the Allies lost the war, they could not repay their loans. American banks would collapse, and the economy would crater. So when President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war in April 1917, it was not just about making the world safe for democracy or German aggression. It was about protecting powerful American financial interests. Senator George Norris of Nebraska stated it explicitly during the debate over the war declaration. He said, "We are going into war upon the command of gold. We are about to put the dollar sign on the American flag." He voted against the war, but Congress voted for it. And J.P. Morgan's loans were suddenly secured by the full might of the American military. After the war, Morgan profited yet again. Germany owed crushing reparations to the Allies, and the Allies owed money to America. Morgan masterfully arranged the loans that allowed Germany to pay reparations, which the Allies then used to repay their American loans. Morgan collected enormous fees at every single step of the circular flow of debt. The Dawes Plan in 1924 and the Young Plan in 1929, both structured by Morgan bankers, refinanced billions in war debt, and Morgan collected millions in fees. World War II followed the same script. Before America entered the war, Morgan banks financed British war purchases. Morgan banks underwrote them, collecting fees on every issuance. And after the war, Morgan banks financed the Reconstruction. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe, was administered partly through Morgan Connected Financial. The Morgan family is no longer involved in the day-to-day operations of the bank, but their wealth remains. The family fortune is estimated at $30 billion, built on the simple business of lending money for wars and collecting interest while soldiers died paying the ultimate cost. This brings us to the modern era of warfare dominated by corporations like Lockheed Martin, or more precisely, the companies that merged to become Lockheed Martin. Military aviation has been an incredibly profitable business since the very First World War. The Lucas brothers, who later spelled their name Lockheed, founded their aircraft company in 1912. By World War I, they were building planes for the military. These were small contracts for exposure of warfare, and the commies that got in on the ground floor positioned themselves for a century of guaranteed profits. World War I saw a limited use of aircraft, mostly for reconnaissance with some primitive bombing raids, but the potential was terrifyingly clear. After the war, military aviation contracts dried up, and many aircraft companies went bankrupt. Lockheed survived by building civilian planes, but they shrewdly kept their military connections alive and well. World War II was their monumental breakthrough. Aircraft were the decisive weapon of the war. Bombers, fighters, and transport planes were all essential. Lockheed built the legendary P-38 Lightning fighter with over 10,000 produced. They built the Hudson bomber with over 2,800 produced. The contracts were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They did not just build planes. They built ironclad relationships with the Pentagon. They hired retired military officers as high-paid executives. They strategically located their factories in key congressional districts where powerful representatives needed to bring jobs to their constituents. They made themselves politically untouchable after World War II. Lockheed built the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, and a C-130 cargo plane, which is still in use today. Every decade brought new threats and new contracts, and Lockheed's business strategy was always the same. Build good enough products, deliberately underestimate the costs to secure the contract, and then come back to the government for more and more money, claiming the project is more complex than originally expected. The Pentagon always paid. They had to, because canceling a multi-billion-dollar project meant admitted catastrophic waste. The C-5 Galaxy transport plane is the perfect example of this model. The initial contract in 1965 was for $2.1 billion. By the time the planes were delivered, the actual cost had ballooned to $5.3 billion, 150% over budget. Did Lockheed lose money? Of course not. It was a cost-crudo contract. They were paid for all their costs, plus a guaranteed profit. The Pentagon could not cancel the project because they had already spent billions. So they paid up. Lockheed profited, and Congress approved it all because the factory employed thousands of voters in Georgia, a key political state. Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq, every conflict brought a new wave of Lockheed contracts. By the 1990s, the military-industrial complex was consolidating. Lockheed merged with Martin Marietta in 1995 to become the Titan Lockheed Martin. They had $65 billion in revenue in 2023, with a staggering 90% of that coming directly from government contracts. And the pattern continues. The F-35 fighter jet is the most expensive weapons program in human history. The original budget was $233 billion. The current cost estimate is over $1.7 trillion. That is trillion with a T. It is 7 times over budget, and Lockheed Martin is getting paid for every single cost overrun. The Pentagon covers it because they cannot cancel. Too much money has been invested, too many jobs are at stake, and too many congressional districts are dependent on the program. The Lockheed family no longer directly controls the company. It is publicly traded. But the shareholders profit immensely, and the pattern established over a century ago continues uninterrupted. A war is declared. Lockheed's stock price rises, contracts are awarded, costs inevitably overrun, the government pays, shareholder breadth timpany. Finally, we have Halliburton, the company that perfected military lie-tech art form. Halliburton was founded in 1919 by Earl P. Halliburton. Initially, it was an oil services company, specializing in cementing oil wells, but the founder understood that building infrastructure, whether for oil fields or for military bases, was an incredibly lucrative. The pattern was established early on the military needs. Infrastructure built fast, Halliburton has the expertise and the equipment ready to go. They are awarded no-bid contracts because in the heat of war there is no time for a competitive bidding process. They build the facility, and the cost-crudo contract structure means they are paid for all their expenses plus a guaranteed profit margin. They cannot lose money. The Korean War saw Halliburton building more bases and infrastructure. Vietnam was even bigger. Halliburton, through its subsidiary Brown & Root, built roads, ports, and airfields throughout South Vietnam. The contracts were worth billions, and they were awarded without any competitive bidding because Brown & Root had deep political connections. And here is where the political connection becomes undeniably critical. George Brown, the founder of Brown & Root, was a major political donor to Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson's entire political career was partly funded by Brown. When Johnson became president, Brown & Root received massive no-bid contracts to build Vietnam's infrastructure. A coincidence, perhaps, but the pattern is clear. Political donations lead to political access, which leads to government contracts, which leads to enormous profit. The Gulf War in 1991 brought Halliburton back into the spotlight. Dick Cheney was the Secretary of Defense. Halliburton received contracts to build facilities in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. After the war, Cheney left the government and became the CEO of Halliburton in 1995. He ran the company until the year 2000 when he became vice president under George W. Bush. And then came the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Halliburton, through its subsidiary KBR, received contracts worth over $40 billion. These were no-bid cost-crudo contracts. Halliburton built bases, provided food services, supplied fuel, and managed all logistics. And the costs were astronomical. The Pentagon's own Inspector General found billions of dollars in waste and overcharges. Halliburton billed the government for meals that were never served, for fuel deliveries that never happened, for construction projects that were never completed, and when questioned, Halliburton's defense was that war zones are chaotic and some level of waste is simply inevitable. The government agreed and kept paying the bills. Dick Cheney, as vice president, officially recused himself from any contract decisions involving his former company. But Halliburton received more government contracts during his tenure than in any other period in its history. From 2003 to 2008, Halliburton's government contracts increased by 400%. Their stock price tripled, and when Cheney left office in 2009, he still held Halliburton stock options worth millions of dollars. This is the modern pattern. Perfected. A company hires powerful politicians as executives. Those executives use their relationships in government. The machine is self-perpetuating. But the 5 original families were just the beginning. The system they created has now evolved into a corporate ecosystem far more powerful and insidious than they could have ever imagined. The game has not changed. It has only scaled up. The historical dynasties paved the way for the modern corporate titans: Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and Boeing. These are not family businesses anymore. They are publicly traded behemoths with shareholders all over the world, including massive pension funds and institutional investors. Your retirement fund might be profiting from this very system without you even knowing it. Take the recent conflict in Ukraine. It has been a human tragedy of immense proportions, but for the defense industry it has been a bonanza. When the call went out for Javelin and Stinger missiles, it was Raytheon Technologies that saw its stock price climb. When the highly effective HIMARS rocket systems turned the tide on the battlefield, it was Lockheed Martin that cashed the multi-billion-dollar replenishment checks from the Pentagon. These companies are not just suppliers. They are now integral parts of foreign policy. The weapons they produce are tools of statecraft, and the demand for these tools is kept perpetually high by a world simmering with conflict, a reality that these companies have a vested financial interest in maintaining. It is the constant, seamless flow of high-ranking personnel between the Pentagon, Congress, and the defense industry. It is not just Dick Cheney, it is a systemic feature of how Washington works. When a general or an admiral retires, they do not just fade away. They take their decades of experience, their security clearances, and most importantly, their extensive network of contacts from the Pentagon and sell them to the highest bidder in the defense industry. General Lloyd Austin served on the board of Raytheon before he became the current Secretary of Defense. General James Mattis sat on the board of General Dynamics before he became Secretary of Defense. These are not bad men, but they are products of a system that inherently blurs the line between public service and private profit. They spend their military careers managing the very weapons systems built by these companies, and then they retire to lucrative board positions at those same companies. Is it any wonder that military budgets continue to bloat? Or that weapons programs plagued by delays and cost overruns are never ever canceled? The people making the decisions today know that a seven-figure job could be waiting for them tomorrow if they maintain the right relationship. It creates a powerful unspoken incentive to keep the money flowing, to approve the next generation fighter jet or missile system regardless of its actual strategic necessity or cost effectiveness, and to ensure public and political support for this endless spending. The industry has built a sophisticated influence machine. It starts with lobbying. The top 5 defense contractors alone spend over $60 million a year on lobbying Congress and the Pentagon. That money buys access, it buys influence, and it ensures that their priorities are heard loud and clear. But it goes deeper. They fund a vast network of think tanks that produce the academic and policy papers that shape the national security debate. Institutions like the Center for a New American Security or the Atlantic Council receive significant funding from defense contractors. Then there's scholars and experts, many of whom are former military officials, appear on cable news as impartial analysts, advocating for a more aggressive foreign policy or highlighting a new threat from China or Russia that requires, coincidentally, a new generation of weapons systems that their funders happen to build. This creates an echo chamber. The think tanks produce the rationale, the media broadcasts it, and Congress feels public pressure to act by increasing the defense budget. It is a brilliant, self-sustaining cycle of manufactured consent, and while these corporations count their profits in the billions, there is another ledger that is rarely discussed: the human cost. For every F-35 fighter jet that rolls off the assembly line at a cost of over $100 million per plane, how many veterans are waiting months for critical mental health care? For every billion-dollar increase in the Pentagon's budget, how much is cut from education, infrastructure, or scientific research? We have the most advanced military in human history, yet our bridges are crumbling, our healthcare system is breaking, and our students are drowning in debt. This is a direct result of our national priorities that have been heavily skewed by the immense political power of the war-for-profit industry. It is a transfer of wealth from the public good to private hands, laundered through the justification of national security. And the ultimate price is paid not by the executives or the shareholders, but by the young men and women who come home from these wars with broken bodies and shattered minds, and by the civilians in distant lands who are caught under the bombs that these companies so profitably sell. The future of this business model is already taking shape, and it is moving into new, even more lucrative domains: artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, and the weaponization of space. The next arms race is already underway, driven not just by genital competition, but by the corporate imperative for perpetual growth. Defense contractors are investing billions in autonomous weapons. But they also create new and terrifying possibilities for conflict. An AI-driven war could escalate in seconds. Beyond the control of any human operator, a conflict in space could cripple the global communication and financial systems that our entire civilization depends on. Yet the profit motive pushes ever forward, creating new weapons that in turn create new justifications for their use. It is a cycle that has repeated for over 200 years, from gunpowder to artificial intelligence. The technology changes, but the fundamental business model of profiting from human conflict remains the same. The 5 families laid the foundation. Today, a sprawling complex of corporations, lobbyists, and politicians has perfected their work. They have built a system that ensures that no matter who is in the White House, no matter which party controls Congress, and no matter whether the nation is at peace or at war, The one thing that is certain is that they will continue to profit, and the pattern, so deeply embedded in our history, will continue. If this analysis of how war has been turned into a business model has changed how you see military spending, if you finally understand the deep financial incentives that drive conflict, then you are beginning to see the world as it truly is. This is not a lesson they will teach you. In school, they will teach you that these companies are patriotic partners, that they serve the nation, that war profiteering is a fringe conspiracy theory. But the government contracts are public record. The profit statements are there for all to see. The pattern has repeated for over 200 years. 5 foundational families now expanded into a global corporate network, with every war yielding the same result. They profit, we pay, and soldiers die. If you found this analysis cheeky, be sure to subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.